The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with alien chittering and mechanical translations as representatives from 47 species gathered for the most shameful announcement in recorded history. Commander Zethkar of the Dominion fleet stood at the central podium, his crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the harsh lighting as he struggled to find words that wouldn't sound completely ridiculous. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice crackling through the translation matrix. "We have an unprecedented situation regarding the humans." A collective groan rippled through the assembly. The Vorthic delegates' tentacles writhed in obvious distress, while the silicon-based crystallites dimmed their natural luminescence in what could only be described as embarrassment. Everyone knew about the humans, those bipedal mammals from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. They had been discovered barely 2 cycles ago, still confined to their single world, playing with primitive chemical rockets. The breeding games, Zethkar continued, his mandibles clicking nervously, were supposed to be a simple demonstration of galactic superiority, a way to show these newcomers their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. The breeding games had been a tradition for millennia. When a new species was discovered, they were invited to participate in what was essentially a galactic fertility contest. The rules were straightforward. Each species would establish colonies on designated worlds and compete to see who could populate them fastest while maintaining genetic diversity and cultural stability. It was meant to be educational for the primitives, showing them the advanced reproductive strategies and social organization of their galactic betters. The humans had been expected to fail spectacularly. Their reproduction was laughably inefficient, single births after lengthy gestation periods, requiring years of care before offspring reached maturity. Their social structure seemed chaotic and contradictory. Most species had given them a few decades before they collapsed entirely, probably succumbing to infighting or resource depletion. However, Zethkar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Preliminary reports from the monitoring stations indicate that the humans have not only met the population benchmarks but have exceeded them by margins we initially thought were calculation errors. The chamber erupted. The insectoid hive queens began their characteristic high-pitched shrieking, while the aquatic depth dwellers created such violent water turbulence in their tanks that emergency containment fields activated. The mechanical forge builders emitted harsh static bursts that their translators couldn't process, and the energy-based luminals flickered so rapidly they appeared to be having seizures. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony managed to restore order by activating her species' natural pheromone dominance field. As the chemical cloud settled over the assembly, creatures gradually calmed enough for coherent communication. "Impossible," she declared, her forearms gesturing dismissively. "Humans breed like wounded slugs. Their gestation is interminable, their offspring helpless for an absurd duration. Our preliminary studies showed they could barely maintain replacement rates even under optimal conditions." Zethkar activated the main display, showing population charts that made several delegates physically recoil. The numbers don't lie. Colony World Kepler 442b was seeded with 10,000 humans 18 months ago. Current population, 47,000 and growing exponentially. Colony World Ross 128b started with the same number. Current population, 53,000. Every single human colony world is showing similar patterns. The Vorthak delegate's translator crackled with disbelief. They must be using artificial gestation, cloning, or genetic acceleration. No natural biological process could account for such numbers. Our monitoring confirms all offspring are naturally conceived and born through normal human reproductive processes, Zethkar replied grimly. No technological enhancement, no genetic manipulation, no artificial intervention of any kind. They're doing this the old-fashioned way. A terrible silence fell over the chamber as the implications sank in. The breeding games weren't just about population numbers. They were about demonstrating the fundamental superiority of advanced galactic civilization over primitive planetary societies. The winners traditionally became administrative overseers of the losers, a gentle way of introducing new species to galactic society while maintaining proper hierarchical order. If the humans won, they would theoretically become the administrative authority over every participating species. The very thought was absurd, primitive. Mammals giving orders to species that had mastered, faster than light travel before. Humanity discovered agriculture. There must be an explanation, muttered the forge builder representative through mechanical vocal synthesizers. Perhaps they're not following the colony guidelines. Maybe they're importing population from their homeworld. Sethkar's exoskeleton darkened to an unhealthy purple shade. All colonies are monitored by quantum-locked sensors. No unauthorized travel, no population imports, no cheating of any kind. The humans are playing by the rules and somehow winning, through what appears to be nothing more than enthusiasm, and remarkably, creative social organization. The truth was even more disturbing than the numbers suggested. Initial surveillance had shown the human colonies developing in ways that defied conventional wisdom about population growth and resource management. Instead of the expected territorial disputes and resource competition that plagued most rapidly expanding populations, the humans seemed to be thriving through cooperation and innovation that bordered on the miraculous. As the meeting dissolved into panicked chittering and mechanical grinding, one fact remained clear. For the first time in galactic history, the breeding games might actually be won by the species they were designed to humble, and nobody had any idea what that meant for the future of galactic civilization. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the observation dome of New Harmony Colony, watching the third generation of children play in the carefully maintained gardens below. At 35, she had never expected to become a grandmother. Yet here she was, surrounded by a thriving community that defied every prediction the galactic observers had made about human society. The birth rate projections are holding steady, reported Marcus Webb, the colony's chief administrator, as he joined her at the viewing window. Another 47 pregnancies confirmed this month, and the medical bay is reporting 0 complications. The alien observers are practically living in their monitoring station trying to figure out what we're doing differently. Sarah smiled, remembering the initial briefing when they'd first arrived at Kepler 442b. The Galactic Council had provided detailed charts showing optimal breeding patterns for various species, all based on careful resource allocation and controlled population growth. The aliens seemed to approach reproduction the same way they approached everything else, with rigid efficiency and mathematical precision. Humans, as usual, had completely ignored the manual. It's not really mysterious, Sarah mused, watching a group of teenagers help construct a new playground while simultaneously keeping an eye on toddlers. We just did what humans always do when we find ourselves somewhere new and challenging. What humans had done was treat the colony worlds not as breeding grounds for a competition, but as home. The difference was subtle but profound. Where other species established efficient reproduction facilities with optimal resource distribution, humans built communities. They created neighborhoods where children could safely explore, extended family networks that provided support for new parents, and social structures that turned child-rearing from an individual burden into a community celebration. The alien observers had been particularly baffled by human pair bonding strategies. Most galactic species approached mating with the same clinical efficiency they brought to colony management: genetic compatibility assessments, reproductive scheduling, optimal offspring allocation. Humans fell in love. Remember when the Vorthak delegation came to observe our reproductive protocols? Marcus laughed. They spent 3 days trying to figure out why Jake Morrison wrote poetry for Lisa before she agreed to marry him. Their translator kept glitching on the concept of romantic courtship. The real breakthrough had come when the humans realized that the other species were treating the breeding games as exactly that: games. Competition with winners and losers. Humans had approached it as life. They weren't trying to maximize reproduction rates for some abstract victory. They were building homes for their children and grandchildren. This fundamental difference in approach had led to innovations that left their galactic observers scrambling to understand. While other species established separate facilities for different aspects of colony life: residential areas, work zones, reproduction centers, humans had integrated everything into organic communities where life, work, and family overlapped naturally. The results spoke for themselves. Human children grew up surrounded by adults who weren't just biological parents, but invested community members. Young couples received support from experienced families who had already navigated the challenges of raising children in a colony environment. Pregnancy and childbirth became community events rather than individual medical procedures. The psychological reports from the monitoring stations are hilarious, Sarah said, pulling up the latest surveillance summaries on her tablet. Listen to this one. Human reproductive behavior continues to defy logical analysis. Subject couples engage in elaborate bonding rituals that appear to serve no genetic optimization function. Multiple instances observed of male subjects performing what appears to be competitive display behavior involving musical instruments and floral arrangements. They're trying to understand why Tom Riley learned to play guitar to impress Janet Phillips, Marcus translated. And this one, Sarah continued, colony social structure remains anarchic by galactic standards, yet population growth rates exceed all projections. Human offspring receive care from multiple unrelated adults in apparent violation of standard genetic protection protocols. They can't wrap their heads around the concept that Janet Phillips helps take care of the Morrison kids even though they're not related to her. The alien observers had been expecting humans to follow the same patterns as every other species in the breeding games, establish hierarchical breeding structures, implement resource rationing systems, maintain genetic tracking databases, and optimize reproduction through careful scientific management. Instead, humans had thrown weekend barbecues where young people met potential partners, while their parents supervised. Children and grandparents shared stories. What the Galactic observers recorded as inefficient resource allocation was actually community gardens where families shared the work and the harvest. What they labeled chaotic social organization was neighborhood networks where everyone looked out for everyone else's children. What they described as non-optimal reproductive scheduling was people having children when they felt ready and wanted to, surrounded by communities that celebrated and supported new life. The funniest part, Marcus said, is that they keep looking for our secret technology. The forge builders sent a delegation convinced we must have some kind of advanced fertility enhancement. They spent 2 weeks trying to reverse engineer our playground equipment. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more complex than the aliens could comprehend. Humans weren't trying to win a breeding competition. They were doing what humans had always done when faced with a new frontier. They were building homes, creating communities, falling in love, and raising children who would carry their dreams forward into an uncertain future. The Galactic observers could document the numbers, but they couldn't quantify the Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered around improvised tables, sharing stories and planning for tomorrow. They could record birth rates, but they couldn't measure the hope in a father's eyes as he held his newborn daughter for the first time, while his neighbors celebrated around him. As Sarah watched the children below, she realized the humans had already won something far more valuable than any breeding competition. They had won the future, one family at a time. Ambassador Veltar's forearms trembled as she reviewed the latest reports from the human monitoring stations. The numbers were no longer just surprising, they were becoming genuinely alarming. Every human colony world was not only exceeding population benchmarks but doing so while maintaining indicators for health, happiness, and social stability that made other species' achievements look pathetically inadequate. This cannot be natural evolution, she muttered to her aide, a young hegemony researcher whose secondary brain was specially adapted for statistical analysis. No species develops this rapidly without artificial enhancement. The aide's tertiary eye focused on the holographic displays showing human colony development patterns. Honored Ambassador, our xenobiology teams have conducted extensive analysis. There are no signs of genetic modification, pharmaceutical intervention, or technological augmentation. The humans appear to be achieving these results through what they term social innovation. Veltar's primary brain refused to process this information properly. Social innovation was a contradiction in terms. Innovation came from technological advancement, genetic optimization, or enhanced cognitive processing. Society was just the framework within which these improvements were implemented. The idea that social structures themselves could drive such dramatic improvements was absurd. "Show me the Ross 128b monitoring data again," she commanded. The holographic display materialized, showing a time-lapse view of the human colony's development over the past 18 months. Veltar watched as the initial settlement of 10,000 humans had grown into a bustling community of over 50,000, spread across multiple interconnected settlements that defied every principle of efficient colonial architecture. Instead of the logical grid patterns and specialized zones that characterized advanced galactic settlements, the human colonies had grown organically, following natural terrain features and what appeared to be purely aesthetic considerations. Buildings were scattered in clusters around common areas, connected by winding paths that seemed designed for leisurely walking rather than efficient transportation. Explain to me again why their settlement patterns are so inefficient yet somehow support higher population densities than our optimal designs, Veltar demanded. The aide's secondary brain processed the data while his primary consciousness formulated a response. The human settlements integrate residential, commercial, and recreational functions in ways that reduce transportation costs and increase social interaction frequency. Their inefficient layouts actually create more usable space per capita while fostering community connections that appear to support psychological well-being. This was exactly the kind of nonsensical explanation that had been plaguing the monitoring efforts. Galactic civilization had spent millions of years optimizing colonial design based on mathematical principles and resource efficiency. The idea that random human intuition could somehow improve on millennia of scientific development was insulting to every advanced species in the galaxy. What about their resource management? Veltar pressed. Surely they must be experiencing the standard colonial shortages by now. The aide activated a new data stream showing resource utilization patterns across all human colonies. Actually, honored ambassador, their resource efficiency has improved as their populations grew. They appear to have developed what they call sharing economies that dramatically reduce individual resource consumption while maintaining high quality of life indicators. Veltar studied the data with growing disbelief. Instead of the expected resource competition that should have developed as populations expanded, the humans had somehow created systems where larger communities used resources more efficiently than smaller ones. They shared tools, vehicles, and equipment through informal networks that weren't even officially organized, just social customs that had emerged naturally. This is impossible, Veltar declared. Resource competition is a fundamental law of colonial development. As populations grow, resource scarcity increases, leading to social stratification and controlled distribution systems. That's basic colonial physics. Yes, honored ambassador, but the humans don't appear to understand colonial physics. They keep treating resources as community assets rather than individual possessions. For example, instead of each family owning separate transportation devices, neighborhoods share vehicle pools. Instead of individual food production, they maintain community gardens. Instead of private tool ownership, they established sharing libraries where anyone can borrow equipment as needed. The aide pulled up specific examples that made Veltar's exoskeleton ache with confusion. In the settlement of New Providence on Kepler 442b, a single advanced manufacturing unit that should have supported perhaps 50 families was somehow meeting the needs of over 500 through what humans called maker spaces, communal workshops where people collaborated on projects instead of competing for access to limited resources. Even more baffling was their approach to childcare. Galactic Standard required one adult caregiver per offspring, with efficiency improvements achieved through specialized breeding facilities. The humans had somehow developed systems where multiple adults shared childcare responsibilities, creating what they called extended families that didn't even require genetic relationships. Look at this. The aide highlighted a surveillance recording from the New Harmony colony. This human female is providing childcare for offspring that share no genetic material with her. She receives no compensation, holds no official position in the reproductive hierarchy, and gains no social status from this activity. Yet she continues to invest time and resources in caring for these unrelated juveniles. Veltar watched the recording, seeing a middle-aged human woman helping a group of children with what appeared to be educational activities, while their biological parents worked elsewhere in the community. The woman seemed genuinely happy, laughing with the children and showing obvious affection for them, despite the complete absence of genetic motivation for such behavior. It's as if they don't understand basic evolutionary principles, Veltar mused. They behave as though the entire community's offspring were their personal genetic investment. That observation aligns with broader patterns in human social organization, the aide confirmed. They consistently prioritize community benefit over individual advantage in ways that should lead to exploitation by selfish actors. Yet somehow these communities remain stable and productive. The implications were staggering. If humans could somehow transcend the fundamental competitive pressures that shaped all known galactic societies, they weren't just winning a breeding competition, they were demonstrating a completely different model of civilization. And if that model proved more effective than the carefully optimized systems that had governed galactic society for millennia, the consequences for established hierarchies would be catastrophic. Veltar's forearms moved in the traditional gesture of deep contemplation as she realized that the breeding games had accidentally unleashed something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Proof that everything the galaxy thought it knew about civilization might be wrong. Captain Elena Rodriguez hadn't expected to become the center of galactic attention when she'd volunteered to lead the Proxima Colony expedition. But now she found herself hosting a parade of alien dignitaries who seemed desperate to understand how her people had broken the breeding games. The latest visitor was High Researcher Kethval of the Crystallite Consciousness, a being of living silicon whose thoughts generated visible light patterns across its translucent surface. The creature had been flickering in increasingly agitated patterns for the past hour as Elena tried to explain human community organization. Your social structures defy all known models of sustainable civilization, Kethval pulsed, its mineral body casting rainbow patterns across Elena's office walls. You have no central breeding authority, no resource allocation hierarchy, no population control mechanisms. By all calculations, your colonies should have collapsed into chaos within months. Elena sipped her coffee. Real coffee, grown in the community gardens that had somehow become more productive than the automated hydroponic systems the aliens had recommended. We do have organization. It's just not the kind you're used to. But where are your efficiency protocols? Kethval's light strobed and what Elena had learned was confusion. Who determines optimal mating pairs? Who allocates reproductive resources? Who prevents overpopulation disasters? Nobody, Elena replied calmly. People figure it out for themselves. The crystallite's entire body dimmed to barely visible levels, which Elena understood was the equivalent of a stunned silence. Through the office window, she could see the afternoon shift change at the community workshop, where David Kim was teaching a group of teenagers how to repair atmospheric processors, while his wife Maria led a singing group for toddlers in the adjacent playground. The scene would have looked chaotic to most galactic observers, but Elena saw the underlying pattern that somehow eluded their sophisticated analysis systems. Perhaps, Kethval ventured hesitantly, you could explain your population control methods? Our projections suggest your colonies should be experiencing resource wars and territorial conflicts by now. Elena leaned back in her chair, trying to find words for something that felt as natural as breathing. We don't control population. We support it. When people want to have children, the community helps them. When they don't, that's fine too. When resources get tight, we find ways to share more efficiently or produce more effectively. But without centralized planning, how do you prevent overshoot scenarios? How do you maintain genetic diversity? How do you ensure optimal resource distribution? We talk to each other, Elena said simply. The crystallite's light patterns became so erratic that Elena worried the being might be having some kind of seizure. You talk to each other? That's your entire social management system? Elena nodded toward the window, where she could see examples of what she meant playing out in real time. See Martha Henderson over there? The woman with the gray hair helping with the gardens. She's been talking to the new families about where to build their homes, sharing 40 years of experience about microclimates and soil conditions. And those teenagers working on the processors? David's not just teaching them technical skills. He's sharing stories about the problems he's solved, the mistakes he's made, the innovations that worked. But this is mere information transfer, Kethval protested, its lights flickering in what Elena recognized as distress. It lacks systematic analysis, optimization protocols, efficiency metrics. It's not just information, Elena explained patiently. It's wisdom. When Sarah Chen tells a new mother about the challenges she faced raising kids in low gravity, she's not just sharing data. She's sharing care, concern, emotional support. When Tom Riley shows someone how to maximize crop yields in the community garden, he's not just transferring technical knowledge, he's investing in the community's future. Elena stood up and gestured for Kethval to follow her outside. Come on, let me show you what I mean. They walked through the colony's winding paths, past the integrated workshops where multiple families collaborated on projects, through the residential areas where homes were designed to facilitate both privacy and community interaction, around the common areas where children played while adults worked and socialized. Your monitoring systems document all of this, Elena said as they paused near a group of parents organizing a childcare rotation. But you're looking for formal structures, official hierarchies, systematic protocols. You're missing the actual system because it doesn't look like anything in your databases. They stopped at the community center, where Elena could see 3 different activities happening simultaneously. A group of engineers troubleshooting atmospheric recycling issues, a cluster of families planning a harvest festival, and a small crowd of people debating whether to accept a new family that had requested transfer from another human colony. Watch, Elena said quietly. See how the conversation flows? Mark Patel is talking about atmospheric pressure optimization, but he's also listening to Janet Morrison's concerns about her daughter's allergies. Sandra Williams is planning festival logistics, but she's also incorporating Tom Riley's suggestions about showcasing the new hydroponic systems. Everyone's contributing to multiple conversations simultaneously. Kethval's light pattern slowed as it focused on the human interactions. This appears highly inefficient. Multiple parallel processing streams with overlapping authority structures and redundant information flows. It's not redundant, Elena corrected. It's resilient. When people share overlapping responsibilities and redundant knowledge, the community becomes stronger. If one person gets sick or makes a mistake, others can step in. If one approach doesn't work, there are backup plans that evolved naturally through all these conversations. They continued their walk, and Elena pointed out example after example of the informal systems that had emerged without central planning. The tool library that prevented resource duplication while ensuring everyone had access to needed equipment. The skill-sharing network where expertise flowed freely based on need and availability. The conflict resolution processes that had evolved to handle disputes without formal authority structures. But how do you ensure optimal outcomes? Kethval asked desperately. How do you prevent suboptimal decisions? How do you maximize efficiency? Elena smiled as they reached the memorial garden, where the community honored both the loved ones they'd left behind on Earth and the friends who had died during the early, difficult months of colonial establishment. We don't optimize for efficiency. We optimize for humanity. As the crystallite's lights dimmed in contemplation, Elena realized that this might be the key insight that had eluded all their galactic observers. Other species had developed advanced technologies and sophisticated social organizations, but they had optimized for abstract efficiency rather than actual life. Humans had accidentally discovered that when you optimize for human flourishing instead of mathematical perfection, you create systems that are not just more successful, but fundamentally different in ways that transcended simple measurements of productivity or population growth. The breeding games had never been about breeding at all. They had been about life itself. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened under circumstances that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The same chamber that had witnessed countless victories by established galactic powers now buzzed with the desperate chatter of species facing an existential challenge to everything they understood about. Civilization Supreme Coordinator Tislan of the Void touched called the assembly to order, her energy-based form crackling with barely contained anxiety. As one of the galaxy's oldest species, the Void Touched had presided over hundreds of breeding games, always confident in the natural order that placed technologically advanced species at the top of galactic hierarchy. Fellow beings, she began, her translated voice carrying harmonics of distress that transcended species barriers. We face an unprecedented crisis. The humans have not merely won the breeding games. They have fundamentally altered what it means to win. The display screens around the chamber lit up with data that made seasoned diplomats recoil in disbelief. Every human colony world showed population numbers that defied conventional modeling, resource efficiency that approached theoretical maximums, and social stability indicators that exceeded the best achievements of species with millennia of optimization experience. The final tallies are indisputable, announced Commander Zethkar, his crystalline exoskeleton now displaying stress fractures that spoke to sleepless cycles spent reviewing impossible data. Total human colonial population, 437,000, 812 individuals. This represents a growth rate of 4,278% over the initial seeding populations. A profound silence fell over the assembly. The second-place finisher, the highly reproductive swarm queens of the Kittiness Collective, had achieved a respectable but conventional 287% growth rate. The humans hadn't just won, they had obliterated every existing record by margins that suggested they were playing an entirely different game. More disturbing than the raw numbers, continued Zethkar, are the implications for galactic social order. According to the traditional rules of the breeding games, humanity now holds administrative authority over all 46 participating species. The chamber erupted in panic. Mechanical screeching from the forge builders mixed with subsonic wails from the deep dwellers, while the hive queens released pheromone clouds so thick that emergency ventilation systems engaged automatically. The very concept of primitive mammals holding authority over ancient galactic civilizations was so absurd that many species' translation systems simply crashed. Ambassador, Feltar managed to restore order through sheer force of will and her species' natural chemical dominance. Surely we cannot honor such an obviously flawed outcome. The breeding games were designed as educational exercises for primitive species, not legitimate competitions for galactic governance. The rules were established by this council and agreed to by all participants. Thaisalon replied with the weary acceptance of someone who had spent weeks trying to find legal loopholes that didn't exist. The humans were informed of the stakes and accepted them. They played by every rule we established, used only technologies we approved, and achieved their results through methods that remained completely legal under galactic law. High researcher Kethval's mineral form pulsed with the slow, deep lights that indicated profound contemplation. Perhaps the issue is not whether we should honor the results, but whether we can survive them. My recent observations of human colonial development suggest they have discovered social technologies that could revolutionize galactic civilization. Impossible, declared the forge builder, representative through mechanical synthesizers. Social organization is not technology. It is merely the framework for implementing actual technological solutions. Then explain their resource efficiency, Kethval challenged, projecting data that showed human colonies achieving sustainability metrics that exceeded theoretical maximums. Explain their conflict resolution systems that maintain social stability without enforcement hierarchies. Explain their innovation rates that accelerate as their populations grow instead of declining due to bureaucratic complexity. The truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge was that human success hadn't been achieved through any recognizable technology or optimization strategy. Instead, they had somehow created social systems that transcended the fundamental limitations that constrained every known galactic civilization. What they have discovered, Kethval continued, his lights growing brighter with conviction, is that cooperation can be more powerful than competition, that distributed decision-making can be more efficient than centralized control, that investing in community welfare can produce better outcomes than optimizing individual advantages. Theoretical impossibility, the Swarm Queen buzzed through her translator. Competition drives evolution. Hierarchy ensures efficiency. Individual optimization maximizes species survival. These are fundamental laws. Yet the humans have apparently transcended them, Thessalan observed. The question now is whether we acknowledge their victory and learn from their methods, or whether we attempt to invalidate results that threaten our understanding of civilization itself. The debate that followed would later be remembered as the most significant in galactic history. Some species argued for technical disqualification, claiming that human success must somehow violate rules they couldn't identify. Others proposed renegotiating the terms retroactively, suggesting that the breeding games had been flawed from conception. But a growing minority, led by Kethval and supported by species that had observed human colonies firsthand, argued for a more radical approach, accepting human victory and requesting their guidance in implementing similar social innovations across galactic civilization. Consider the implications, Kethval pulsed earnestly. If human methods can produce such dramatic improvements in quality of life, sustainability, and social stability, perhaps the question is not whether they deserve to win, but whether we deserve to learn from them. As the debate raged, reports continued arriving from human colonies showing impossible achievements. conflict resolution without enforcement, resource sharing without exploitation, innovation without centralized research programs, and population growth without environmental destruction. The humans hadn't just won a breeding competition, they had accidentally demonstrated that everything the galaxy thought it knew about the fundamental limitations of civilization might be wrong. And now, for the first time in galactic history, the advanced species of the galaxy were going to have to ask a primitive planetary civilization to teach them how to live. The age of human authority was about to begin, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not. Dr. James Patterson had been a small-town sociology professor before the breeding games began, spending his days teaching undergraduate courses about community organization and social movements to students who mostly cared about getting through requirements for their engineering degrees. Now he found himself in the surreal position of conducting orientation seminars for ancient galactic civilizations who wanted to understand how human society actually worked. The current session was particularly challenging because his audience included representatives from 12 different species, each with their own assumptions about how social organization should function. The void-touched delegate flickered nervously in her containment field, while the crystallite observer maintained the slow, steady light patterns that indicated deep analytical focus. The mechanical forge builder had been taking detailed recordings for 3 hours, and the aquatic deep dweller kept releasing small bubbles of what James had learned was equivalent to confused muttering. "Let me try to explain this differently," James said, calling up a holographic display that showed the development timeline of New Geneva Colony. "You keep asking about our management structure, our hierarchy, our command protocols, but you're looking for the wrong things." The Vorthak delegate's tentacles writhed in obvious frustration. All successful civilizations require systematic organization. There must be leaders who make decisions, followers who implement them, and enforcement mechanisms that ensure compliance. Without these elements, you have chaos. "We do have organization," James replied patiently, "but it's organic rather than imposed. Watch this recording from last month's community meeting." The holographic display showed what looked like barely controlled chaos to most galactic observers. Dozens of humans talking simultaneously, interrupting each other, laughing, arguing, and somehow reaching consensus on complex community decisions without any apparent leadership structure. "I see no clear authority figure directing the discussion," observed the crystallite delegate. "No systematic analysis of options, no logical decision trees, no optimization protocols. How do you ensure optimal outcomes?" James paused the recording at a moment when Sarah Chen was mediating a disagreement between two families about resource allocation, while simultaneously helping a group of teenagers plan a project and keeping one eye on a toddler who was exploring the meeting space. "Sarah's not in charge of this meeting," he explained. "Nobody is officially. But she's helping facilitate because she has experience with similar problems. People trust her judgment, and she's good at helping groups find solutions that work for everyone." "But what prevents her from exploiting this authority for personal gain?" demanded the forge builder representative. "What systematic checks exist to ensure she serves community interests rather than individual optimization?" This was the question that seemed to baffle galactic observers more than any other. Every advanced civilization had developed elaborate systems to prevent the exploitation of social authority, because their assumption was that individuals would naturally prioritize personal advantage over community welfare. "The same thing that prevents anyone else from exploiting community trust," James answered. "She lives here. Her children and grandchildren live here. Her friends and neighbors live here. If she started making decisions that hurt the community, she'd be hurting herself and everyone she cares about." James advanced the recording to show the resolution of the resource dispute, where both families ended up with better solutions than either had originally proposed, largely because Sarah had helped them see how their individual needs could be met through community cooperation rather than competition. "But this is inefficient," protested the Swarm Queen delegate. Through her translator, "Optimal resource allocation requires centralized analysis and systematic distribution protocols. This discussion-based approach wastes time and introduces subjective variables that compromise mathematical optimization." James smiled, recognizing an argument he'd been having with galactic observers for months. "You're measuring the wrong kind of efficiency. Yes, it takes longer to reach decisions when everyone gets to participate, but the solutions we reach are more effective because everyone understands them, supports them, and helps implement them. He called up comparative data from human colonies versus other species settlements. Look at implementation success rates. When the hegemony issues optimized resource allocation directives, compliance averages around 73%. When human communities reach consensus decisions, implementation approaches 98%. Compliance can be enforced through systematic monitoring and correction protocols, the Vorthak delegate pointed out. Surely centralized optimization with enforcement mechanisms produces superior outcomes to chaotic discussion processes. Does it, though? James challenged, displaying long-term sustainability metrics. Your enforcement systems require constant energy expenditure to monitor compliance and correct violations. Our consensus systems are self-reinforcing because people follow decisions they helped make. The Deep Dweller representative had been unusually quiet, but now released a series of bubbles that translated as thoughtful observation. We have noted that human colonies show remarkable adaptability to changing conditions. When unexpected challenges arise, they modify their approaches rapidly without requiring administrative authorization. Exactly. James nodded. Because decision-making authority is distributed throughout the community, we can respond to local conditions immediately. We don't have to wait for central analysis and updated protocols. He showed them recordings from the previous year when a solar storm had damaged the atmospheric processors on New Geneva. Instead of waiting for official repair protocols, 3 different neighborhood groups had simultaneously begun working on solutions, sharing information and resources freely, until the crisis was resolved. This violates fundamental principles of specialized expertise management, the Forge builder observed. Atmospheric processing requires technical knowledge. Allowing unqualified individuals to attempt repairs introduces catastrophic failure risks. But they weren't unqualified, James explained. Marcus Webb had 20 years of engineering experience. David Kim had worked on similar systems back on Earth. Janet Morrison had studied atmospheric chemistry in college. And even people without technical training contributed by coordinating resources, managing communications, and supporting the families of people working on the crisis. The crystallite delegate's lights pulsed in a pattern James had learned indicated deep confusion. You allow critical infrastructure maintenance to be performed by individuals whose qualifications have not been systematically verified? We trust people to know their own capabilities and to ask for help when they need it, James replied. Marcus knows atmospheric systems, so he leads that work. But he also knows his limitations. So he consults with experts on Earth through communication, links and works with local people who understand the specific conditions of our colony. This was perhaps the most difficult concept for galactic civilizations to grasp, the idea that competence could be recognized and utilized without formal credentialing systems. Every advanced species had developed elaborate bureaucracies to verify qualifications, assign responsibilities, and monitor performance. The human approach of letting people contribute based on their actual knowledge and abilities, validated through community relationships rather than institutional certification, seemed impossibly chaotic. What prevents incompetent individuals from claiming expertise they lack? Demanded the Vorthak delegate. What systematic safeguards exist to ensure quality control? James called up a recording from the community workshop, where David Kim was teaching atmospheric processor maintenance to a group of volunteers. The same thing that prevents any other kind of harmful behavior in a close-knit community. Reputation, relationships, and consequences. In the recording, David was patiently explaining a complex procedure while openly acknowledging the limits of his own knowledge and encouraging students to research additional resources. When one student suggested a modification that David wasn't sure about, he immediately called a colleague on another colony world to verify the approach before proceeding. David's not just teaching technical skills, James explained. He's modeling intellectual humility, collaborative problem-solving, and community responsibility. If he taught something wrong, it wouldn't just damage equipment. It would hurt his neighbors and his own reputation in the community. The session continued for another hour, with James patiently explaining how human communities had somehow transcended the assumed trade-offs between efficiency and participation, between expertise and accessibility, between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The Galactic observers took detailed notes, recorded everything, and asked increasingly desperate questions about implementation protocols and systematic optimization strategies, but James could see in their confused reactions that they were still missing the fundamental point. Human communities worked not because of any particular technique or system, but because they were built on a foundation of trust, care, and shared responsibility that couldn't be replicated through administrative procedures or institutional reforms. 3 years had passed since the official conclusion of the breeding games, and Captain Elena Rodriguez found herself in the unprecedented position of serving as humanity's first Galactic Administrative Coordinator. The title was impressive, but the reality was far more complex and amusing than anyone had anticipated. When the ancient protocols had been written, her office on the neutral station of Consensus Point overlooked a busy corridor, where the strangest sight in galactic history had become routine. Representatives from advanced alien civilizations lining up to request guidance from humans. Today's queue included a delegation of forge builders seeking advice on community resource sharing, a group of crystallite researchers wanting to understand human conflict resolution methods, and 3 swarm queens who had somehow convinced their hives to experiment with consensus decision-making. "The quarterly reports are in," announced Dr. Sarah Chen, who had somehow transitioned from colonial grandmother to humanity's chief advisor on social innovation, and they're still unbelievable. Elena accepted the data pad, though she already knew what it would show. Across 47 different galactic civilizations, communities that had implemented human-inspired social reforms were showing dramatic improvements in everything from resource efficiency to psychological well-being indicators. The hegemony worlds that adopted community workshops are reporting 37% increases in innovation rates, Sarah continued. The crystallite collectives that established consensus councils have reduced social conflicts by over 60%. Even the void-touched are experimenting with distributed leadership models. Elena smiled, remembering the early days when galactic observers had dismissed human social organization as primitive chaos. Now those same species were sending their best researchers to study in human communities, trying to understand how trust and cooperation could produce better outcomes than centuries of optimized hierarchical systems. "What about the resistance movements?" Elena asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Shrinking steadily," Sarah confirmed. "The Coalition of Traditional Order lost another 3-member species this month. Turns out it's hard to argue for the superiority of rigid hierarchies when your neighbors are achieving better results through collaborative approaches." The resistance had been inevitable. Many established galactic powers had initially refused to acknowledge human authority, forming coalitions dedicated to overturning the breeding games results and restoring the natural order of technologically advanced species ruling over primitive newcomers. But as human-inspired reforms produced undeniable improvements in quality of life across participating worlds, the resistance had gradually crumbled. Elena's communication panel chimed with an incoming message from Earth, where President Martinez was dealing with his own surreal situation, governing a planet whose species had somehow become the administrative authority for an entire galaxy while still figuring out how to manage their own climate. "Crisis, Elena," the president's voice carried across the interstellar communication link. "I've got another request from the Galactic Council. They want us to mediate a trade dispute between the Thermal Vents Coalition and the Ice Ring Confederacy. Apparently their traditional arbitration systems have been ineffective for the past 4 centuries, and they think human consensus building might work better." Elena laughed despite herself. 4 centuries of deadlock, and they think we can solve it in what, a few months? "Actually," Sarah interjected, pulling up relevant files, "we probably can. The dispute is really about resource allocation priorities, and both sides are operating under zero-sum assumptions. If we can help them find collaborative solutions that benefit everyone, this should be relatively straightforward." This was perhaps the most startling discovery of the past 3 years. Many of the galactic civilization's most intractable problems were actually quite solvable once you abandoned the assumption that cooperation meant weakness and compromise meant failure. Conflicts that had persisted for millennia often dissolved when approached with human-style collaborative problem-solving. Elena's door chimed, and her assistant announced the arrival of High Researcher Kethval, who had become one of humanity's most dedicated students. The crystallite's mineral form pulsed with excitement as he entered. Coordinator Rodriguez, Kethaval began, his lights bright with enthusiasm. I bring remarkable news from the Andromeda Observation Project. The preliminary data suggests that civilizations throughout the galaxy are beginning to spontaneously develop social innovations similar to human models. Elena raised an eyebrow. Spontaneously? Species that have had no direct contact with human communities are independently discovering the advantages of distributed leadership, consensus decision-making, and community-based resource sharing. It appears that human social technologies are so fundamentally superior that they represent convergent evolution in civilizational development. Sarah leaned forward with interest. You're saying that other species are reinventing human social organization on their own? Precisely, Kethaval confirmed, his lights flickering with patterns that Elena had learned indicated scientific excitement. The mathematical models suggest that human-style collaborative systems may represent optimal solutions to the fundamental challenges of complex social organization. Other species are discovering these solutions independently because they are, in essence, inevitable once certain technological and population thresholds are reached. Elena sat back in her chair, contemplating the implications. Humanity hadn't just won a breeding competition or accidentally discovered effective social technologies. They had apparently stumbled upon universal principles of successful civilization that other species were bound to discover eventually. The irony, she mused, is that we were supposed to be the primitive species learning from advanced galactic civilization. Instead, we've accidentally become teachers for the entire galaxy. Through her office window, Elena could see the daily miracle that had become normal. Former enemies collaborating on joint projects, ancient hierarchies experimenting with egalitarian alternatives, and species that had never communicated directly working together to solve shared challenges. The breeding games had been designed to demonstrate human inferiority. Instead, they had revealed that the most primitive species in the galaxy had somehow developed the most advanced understanding of how conscious beings could live together successfully. You know what the strangest part is? Elena said to Sarah, as they watched a group of young aliens from 6 different species playing together in the station's recreation area, their games seamlessly incorporating the social customs of multiple civilizations. We didn't set out to change galactic civilization. We just did what humans always do. We built communities, raised families, and tried to make life better for everyone around us. And apparently, Sarah replied with a smile, that was exactly what the galaxy needed. Outside the office window, the future was taking shape in the form of unprecedented cooperation between species that had spent millennia competing instead of collaborating. The humans had won more than administrative authority over galactic civilization. They had won the opportunity to help build something better than anyone had imagined possible. The age of human guidance had begun, and for the first time in galactic history, the universe was learning what it meant to truly thrive.